I was born in conditions that can be called unusual. My parents, Sarah and Michael Thompson, were well into their 40s when I came into this world. A miracle that they no longer expected and probably did not believe that it would ever happen. After all, they already had a son, my brother James, whom they adopted when he was about 3 years old. Mom used to tell me the story of how they found James at the local shelter. It was many years after their failed attempts to have a child. They had already accepted that they would not be able to have their own children, and decided to open their hearts to a child who needed a home. When they first saw James with his shock of brown curls and shy smile, it didn't take them a moment to realize that he was their son, someone to whom they could give all their tenderness, care, warmth. From that moment on, James became the center of their world. They gave him everything they could, not only love and attention, but also the best education one could dream of, a cozy home and the confidence that he was dear, that he was always under their protection. James was not an adopted child for them, he was their son. Mom often told how his first steps, first words, first "Mom" made their days brighter, filled the house with real joy. And then, 6 years after his appearance in their lives, something unexpected happened. The doctors couldn't believe it, and neither could Mom. She told how with each new analysis she did not dare to believe that a miracle had happened after all, that perhaps, despite all forecasts and skepticism, a small life was growing inside her. She told me this with a smile and tears in her eyes, and I always saw her heart stop at the memory of those days. On that rainy April day when I was born, Dad said that he had never seen Mom cry so much as when she first picked me up in her arms. They called me Chelsea and considered me an impossible miracle, the embodiment of a dream that seemed to have already disappeared somewhere in the infinity of the past. But James is a completely different story. One of my earliest memories concerns him. I was about 3 years old, hobbling through the grass in our backyard, diligently following James. My chubby legs could barely keep up with his rapid steps, but I stubbornly continued to walk, keeping up, knowing for sure that somewhere ahead he was my beloved older brother. "Jamie, wait for me," I exclaimed, unwittingly using a nickname he couldn't stand. He turned around, and something evil, incomprehensible, almost frightening flashed across his usually calm face. "Stop following me. And don't call me Jamie," he snapped. "But I want to play with you," I replied softly, and my lower lip trembled, threatening to burst into tears. "Well, I don't want to play with you," he snapped, giving me a look full of annoyance. "Why don't you bother Mom and Dad? They will definitely like it, their precious little miracle is nearby." At the time, I didn't understand why he was so angry, why his face changed and became unfriendly when he saw me. There was no malice or resentment in my childish heart, only simple sincere love for my older brother. I sincerely believed that this was how it should be: you love your family, and they love you back. Mom and Dad tried their best to cope with the situation, surrounding James with attention, sometimes even more than they paid to me, although they tried not to allow any obvious injustice. It seemed that every new dress I wore was accompanied by a new thing for James, and every family outing to the park was a separate excursion for him. But despite their efforts, it was as if a shadow stretched between us, invisible and insurmountable, which only grew darker every year. I distinctly remember one day accidentally overhearing my parents talking through his bedroom door, which was ajar. "Chelsea is your sister," my mother said softly, trying to remain calm. "She loves you so much. Can't you try to understand her a little bit?" James's reply pierced the silence. "She's not my sister. It's just the baby you got when you decided I wasn't good enough." Mom's voice trembled, but she didn't answer, just quietly closed the door. Year after year, the tension in the house grew, like a spring about to unclench. When I turned 4, the house became almost unbearable. One evening, I was sitting at the bottom of our stairs, hugging a stuffed rabbit tightly to me, while James's voice echoed through the house, fierce and indomitable as a storm. "I'm not going to see a psychologist," his cry echoed through the corridors. "Do you think I'm crazy?" Mom, as always, tried to calm him down. Her voice was soft, but there was clearly fatigue in it. "We just want to help you, honey. It's hard for you to deal with your feelings, and Dr. Anderson." "Oh, of course." James interrupted her. "Just send the foster child to therapy while your real daughter stays at home." Dad sighed heavily. "This has nothing to do with Chelsea. We're worried about you, James." However, he was no longer listening. "You don't need me anymore." James growled, and at the same moment there was a thud. Probably something heavy, maybe a framed photo, one of those that Mom loved so much, hit the wall. "You already have your perfect little biological child, so why do you even need me? Why don't you just send me back?" "James, please," Mom said in a strangled voice, her voice trembling. "No, we love you as much as Chelsea," she tried to assure him. "You are our son." "Liars," he shouted back. "I'm not your son, I'm just a kid that you picked up when you didn't have anyone else." I froze in my place, mesmerized, clutching the rabbit even tighter. I heard him coming up the stairs with quick steps. His anger was like a storm that took over the whole house. When he walked past me, I felt like he really didn't see me. His face was burning with rage, his cheeks were flushed, and his gaze was cold and distant. He flew into his room and slammed the door so that the whole house shook. This has become our new reality. Every little thing seemed to provoke James into an outburst of rage. Even those moments when my parents tried to include me in his life turned into unpredictable consequences. At basketball games, where they started taking me to support my brother, he just got angry. "Stop bringing her. She's ruining everything," he shouted after one of the games. I remember that day he ran off the court without waiting for the game to end, and walked ahead of us all the way home, ignoring Mom and Dad, who tried to calm him down. The moments when we got together to create the illusion of a single family turned into drama. One summer, Mom bought us both an ice cream cone. I had it with colorful sprinkles, and James had the usual one, without any additives. And although he himself said that he did not want anything superfluous, after a few minutes another breakdown occurred. "Of course, everything is for her, but nothing for me," he said with such pain and resentment that his mother's eyes clouded. These fits of rage were repeated, but they always ended the same way. James locked himself in his room, going into a dead silence, as if he did not exist at all. Mom would quietly leave a tray of food near his door, which he would open only late at night, as if he wanted to make sure everyone was already asleep. Sometimes I heard his soft footsteps in the hallway, and it seemed to me that it was not James, but a ghost wandering around the house. Mom cried when she thought I couldn't see her. She was sitting in the semi-darkness of the kitchen, looking out the window, but could not see anything behind the glass, as if immersed in endless thoughts. Dad stood at the door of James's room, silent, with an invisible weight on his shoulders. He often raised his hand to knock, but then stopped, not daring to break the silence. Their attempts to reach James remained fruitless, and I, watching all this, did not fully understand what was happening, but with some childish instinct I felt that I was part of this invisible but sinister problem. I tried to be as quiet as possible, hiding in the corners of the house, making myself almost invisible, as if my going into the shadows could bring relief to everyone. I was only 6 years old when the news of Aunt Martha's death came. I didn't know her well. She was my mother's cousin and lived a few hours away from here. But even I felt a heavy cloud descend on the house when my mother, pale and confused, hurriedly packed her bag, ready to leave at the same moment. James, you're old enough to look after Chelsea for one day, Mom said, adjusting the strap of her bag, her voice trembling with excitement. We'll be back late tonight. James rolled his eyes to show how indifferent he was, but he nodded anyway. Dad went to the refrigerator and, checking its contents, added, "Food is in the refrigerator. Emergency numbers are on the kitchen board. Call me if something happens." James muttered something unintelligible, finally saying, "I'm 15, I'm not stupid," and frankly showed no interest in their requests. I watched from the window as my parents' car disappeared around the bend, feeling the evening fall outside the window, as if bringing something disturbing. It had been exactly 3 minutes since they left when James, without saying a word, put on his jacket and headed for the door. "Where are you going?" I asked quietly, trying not to sound insistent. "Don't touch my stuff," he snapped, giving me a look full of annoyance. "But Mom and Dad said—" "Mom and Dad say a lot of things," he interrupted. "Just watch TV or do something and don't tell them I'm gone. Or you'll regret it." He slammed the door, leaving me alone in an empty and suddenly huge house. At first, I tried to be brave, as my mother always told me, strong and independent. I watched cartoons, ate a sandwich left in the fridge, and even played with dolls. But as the sun began to set, the shadows in the house lengthened, and with every sound, the house became more and more filled with a strange, oppressive silence. My baby's heart started beating faster with every crackle and rustle. I dialed James's number several times, but his phone was silently going to voicemail, as if he had disappeared without leaving a trace. When darkness finally descended on the house, I felt real fear. I was sitting on the couch, curled up in a ball, wrapped in a soft blanket, and crying quietly, not taking my eyes off the front door, trying to hear the familiar sound of footsteps. It seemed that the darkness around me was breathing, filling all corners. Every sound was amplified to unbearability, and I felt fear squeezing me more and more. It was almost midnight when I finally heard my parents' car stop in the driveway. At that moment, I jumped up and ran to the door, tears streaming down my cheeks, and as soon as I saw my mother, her warm arms immediately hugged me. "Chelsea, what's wrong? Where's James?" Mom whispered, hugging me to her, her voice full of anxiety. "He's gone," I sobbed. "Right after you left." I was so afraid. Dad's face tightened, and there was anger in his eyes that I had never seen before. His gaze became hard and stern. "Did he leave you alone? For the whole day?" His voice sounded like thunder before a storm. James didn't return home until the next morning, and his appearance was strangely casual. He went into the kitchen, where Mom and Dad were waiting for him with tense faces, and did not even bother to respond to their worried looks. "Where have you been?" His father's voice was restrained, but icy. James shrugged, blithely replying, "With friends." "We trusted you," Mom's voice trembled. "Your sister could have been hurt. You're the big brother." "Oh, here we go again." James threw up his hands, barely able to contain his irritation. "All about precious Chelsea. She's fine, isn't she? Stop treating me like a criminal." His words were careless, but there was bitterness hidden in them, something deeply rooted, like a secret poison. His parents punished him by depriving him of his phone and communication with friends for a month, but I could not imagine that James had another card up his sleeve. 2 days after this conversation, a woman from the Child Protection Service called at our door. James filed a complaint accusing his parents of abuse and saying they always preferred me to him. At that moment, sitting in my room, I could hear her voice, calmly and formally talking with Mom and Dad in the living room. I was overwhelmed with guilt, confusion, and fear. Although the investigation quickly revealed that there was no evidence of ill treatment, that the complaint was false, but the moral damage had already been done. Mom cried for several days in a row, not caring that I could see her. Her face looked haggard, her eyes dimmed, as if they had lost a spark that nothing could bring back. Dad walked around the house like a shadow, detached and lost in thought, with an expression of betrayal frozen on his face. In those days, it seemed to me that our family was no longer breathing, but barely living, as if the house had suddenly found itself in a frightening void. In the summer, when James turned 16, something happened that shocked us to the core. I still remember that moment. We were sitting at dinner when James burst into the kitchen, clutching his phone in his hand, his face glowing with some strange excitement. "They found me," he announced with a tremor in his voice, barely able to control his emotions. "My real parents." Mom dropped her fork, and it hit the plate with a clink. Dad carefully put his hand on Mom's under the table, but it didn't seem to help her calm down. James continued, almost trembling with delight. "They wrote to me, said they made a mistake by rejecting me, and now they want to meet." Dad asked cautiously, "Are you sure this is what you want?" "Of course." "These are my real parents," James replied without hesitation, as if the weight of the word was obvious only to him. Mom flinched at the word, but forced herself to smile. Her voice was barely audible, but there was a crack of pain in it. If that's what you want, we'll support you." The first meeting with his biological parents was scheduled at a local restaurant. James returned home beaming and seemingly soaring with happiness. "They're rich," he declared, his face glowing with new confidence. "They have 3 companies. You should have seen their house." From that moment, something unimaginable began. Suddenly, James has a new iPhone. A week later, there was a brand new game console in his room. And then there was a car, a bright red Mercedes, which he parked in front of our house with a smug grin, as if it were his personal trophy. "It must be nice to have parents who can afford normal gifts," he chuckled one morning when his mother noticed his expensive designer shoes. Dad tried to have a restrained conversation with him, but James abruptly interrupted him. "Look at this house, Dad. It's a slum compared to their mansion. Did you know they have a pool and a home theater? There's just nothing to see here." He continued to make his remarks more and more openly, and every conversation became an opportunity to ridicule our home, our habits, and our parents themselves. The comparisons he made became more and more cruel and sarcastic. "You can't even buy normal orange juice," he complained at breakfast. "My real mom takes everything organic." The last straw was the evening when James did not return for dinner. Mom called him tirelessly while Dad was rushing around the living room, anxiously glancing at the clock. By 3 o'clock in the morning, they had not gone to bed, sitting in the dark, and still hoped that he would return. Eventually, the door opened and James walked in, not even trying to hide his annoyance. "Where have you been?" "We were worried." Mom jumped up, her face distorted with pain and fear. James grinned and looked her straight in the eye. "I was with my real parents." Dad stood up, his face flushed with anger. "We're your real parents," he began, but James cut him off coldly. "No, not you. And I'm done with this pretense. I'm leaving," he said, as if he were talking about something that had been decided long ago. "They can give me a real life, not the miserable existence you call family." Mom recoiled as if from a slap in the face. Her eyes filled with tears, she could barely breathe. Do you really want to do this?" James, ignoring her words, pursed his lips in disgust and looked at me as if I were not his sister at all, but an accidental nuisance. "I don't need my parents who betrayed me and a fake sister." The next few weeks were a blur: court visits, meetings with social workers, nerves, and endless conversations. James's biological parents hired the best lawyers and presented their demands, claiming that their son was old enough to choose where to live. The judge agreed with their arguments. On the day James packed his things, he acted with surprising coldness, as if he couldn't wait to leave forever. Mom came up to him, tried to hug him goodbye, but he walked around her as if she were part of the furniture, not a word, not a look, just indifference. Dad was standing at the door, his face tired and his eyes lost. James looked at them goodbye, but there was no warmth or regret in his eyes. Dad quietly said that James would always have a home here, in this cozy place, where traces of his childhood remained in every corner. But James was already heading for his red Mercedes, not turning around, not looking back. He didn't say goodbye, didn't even close the front door behind him. Just the soft echo of footsteps in the driveway and the sound of a car door slamming shut. After he left, life continued, but it seemed that our house had lost a piece of its soul. It was like a phantom pain. He was no longer with us, but the emptiness left by James was constantly reminding us of himself. Sometimes, out of habit, my mother would put 4 dishes on the table, but then, noticing this, she would quietly remove the extra plate. Dad, telling stories at dinner, paused, as if he was internally editing memories, removing from them those moments where James was. They tried to reach him every holiday. I saw my mother choosing Christmas cards, a meticulous, almost ritualistic process, accompanied by quiet sighs. She spent hours signing them, writing neat lines, and then sealing the envelopes with trembling fingers, as if with each closed letter she hoped that, this year, he would definitely respond. But the postcards disappeared into silence, disappearing into the void left by James. Over time, the greeting cards disappeared, and the graduation ticket sent to his last known address, and the letter that Mom wrote when Dad had a small heart operation. Her hopes faded with every gesture she didn't accept, with every year that passed without his response. When I was in high school, late one night, walking past my parents' bedroom, I heard my mother's quiet, strangled crying. She was sobbing into her pillow, her voice coming through broken sobs. "He blocked us, Michael." I tried to call him from Mary's phone, but that number is also disconnected. I don't even see his Facebook page anymore. I just want to know if he's okay. Just to know that he's alive. The next day, I couldn't get her words out of my head. My friend's sister agreed to give me access to her Facebook account so I could search for it. It wasn't difficult to find James's profile. His page shone with luxury and brilliance. It seemed that the life he led was far from anything I had ever known. His last post made my stomach clench, finally got rid of all unnecessary ties to the past. No more reminders of those old men who kept me by their side until they had a child of their own. It's time to live my real life with my real family. The best decision in my life is to live for real. In the photo, James posed on a tropical beach, among bright palm trees and an azure sea. In other shots, he's shown against the backdrop of expensive cars and exclusive clubs, smiling with such sincere joy as I have never seen in our family photos. I closed the page, feeling unbearably heavy, and decided never to tell Mom and Dad about what I saw. They've suffered enough already. The years flew by, and I graduated from high school with honors. Mom and Dad were happy for me as if for the 3 of us. Their pride was warmer and deeper than I could have imagined. I was accepted to college, and I was preparing to start an independent life. By that time, Dad had recovered from the operation, leaving his job at an accounting firm and choosing a more peaceful life. He and Mom volunteered at the local library, enjoyed evening walks, and found solace in taking care of the neighbors' grandchildren. Sometimes I found myself thinking about James, though rarely. I tried to accustom myself to the idea that he was no longer in our lives, that he had chosen this path himself. But sometimes, in the most unexpected moments, I wondered if he ever regretted his choice. Does he miss at least a little those who loved him even before he was surrounded by luxury, money, and endless entertainment? It's been 10 years since he stepped through our front door, leaving us, and it seemed like a lot had changed. But sometimes, when Mom looked at the phone, I could see how her gaze was still frozen, waiting for the call. Understanding did not fill the silence left on the pages of our family albums, where photographs of James were empty, those very teenage years when he should have been with us, but chose a different path. These albums became mute witnesses of pain that could not be replaced. That day, during an economics lecture, when a call came from an unknown number, I barely answered. My gut told me that there was something important behind this ringing, something that I was afraid of. The phone rang. "Is this Chelsea Thompson?" The voice was distantly official, as if it belonged to someone who brought bad news to people every day. "Yes, it's me," I replied, my heart beating faster. "This is Officer Martinez from the County Police Department. I am very sorry to inform you." The rest became an unintelligible stream, words that seemed to barely reach my mind. Car crash. Hospitals. The need for identification. It's like I've lost touch with reality. I don't remember how I left the lecture hall, how I got to the hospital. The only thing that remained in my memory was the sterile light of the hospital room and 2 sheets on a stretcher. They couldn't have been there, it had to be a mistake. After all, my parents were going to come to my place for the weekend. We planned dinner, but now everything has been erased, all their plans, their dreams. The following days passed in a blur. Endless phone calls, bureaucratic procedures, thousands of small decisions that had to be made. The funeral home asked about the flowers. The cemetery required clarification of the site. People came with pots of hot casseroles, although I couldn't eat, couldn't even bring myself to touch the food. Everything seemed pointless. On the day of the funeral, the sky was clear, the air was clear and fresh, and it was this autumn morning that my mother loved the most. The church was filled with familiar faces, neighbors, Dad's colleagues, Mom's friends from the library. I was sitting on the first bench, alone, surrounded by an eerie emptiness. There were 2 coffins in front of me, covered with flowers, white lilies, symbols of purity and farewell. The silence around me weighed on me as I stared at these coffins, unable to believe that those who raised me, who loved me, who were my world, were lying there. A sudden whisper made me turn around. I saw him walking down the aisle. James. My heart fluttered for a moment. He came. After all these years, he came to say goodbye. I hoped I saw something in his face that could bring comfort, but he wasn't alone. He was followed by a man in an expensive suit, carrying a leather briefcase. When James came up to me, there was no trace of grief in his voice. "Hello, Chelsea," he said with a strange indifference. "I'm sorry about the old people." I stared at him, unable to comprehend his words, not believing in his cold, detached tone. "You came," I whispered, hoping to see at least a spark of pain or regret in his eyes. He nodded slightly at the man next to him. "This is Mr. Patterson, my lawyer. Well, my parents' lawyer, actually. My real parents. They think I should represent them in the discussion of inheritance." The word inheritance sounded like a blow. I felt the air rush out of my chest, as if it had physically wounded me. An inheritance? He straightened his tie and, seeing my stunned expression, explained with a smile. "You see, even though I left, but legally I was their son for 13 years. That gives me the right to a share." I barely found the strength to whisper. They're not even in the ground, and are you already talking about inheritance?" He shrugged, not looking at me, as if he were discussing something trivial. It's all about efficiency, Chelsea. I have a new business venture, and the startup capital would not hurt. I turned away, feeling tears welling up in my eyes. James sat on a few benches behind me, and during the eulogies, prayers, and closing hymns, I could still hear the soft taps of his fingers on the phone screen. I risked a glance back and saw him barely holding back a smile as he sent messages, completely detached from the fact that his foster parents, who loved him unconditionally, were lying just a few feet away from him. Mom and Dad taught me that love is patient, love is kind, that love is ready to forgive. But watching James laugh and send messages during their funeral, grinning at each new notification, I realized that love can also break a heart. When we returned after the funeral, the house seemed especially empty, as if its very breathing had stopped. We went into the dining room, where Mr. Collins, the old family notary, who had known us for so many years that he was almost like a family member, was waiting for us. We ate countless family dinners at this very table, where Mom helped me with my homework, and on Sundays Dad did crosswords. Now this table has become the last place where they left a part of themselves for us. James shamelessly sprawled in his mother's favorite chair, as if not noticing what a sacred place he had occupied. His lawyer, Mr. Patterson, was sitting next to him, ready for business discussions. I chose Dad's old place, my fingers stroking the worn edge of the table, as if his warm energy could return. "Let's get started," Mr. Collins said softly, adjusting his glasses. His voice was full of compassion. He probably noticed my reddened eyes. He unfolded a document, a will dated just 2 months before that terrible accident. As Mr. Collins read, I could almost hear my parents' voices intertwining in the solemn rhythm of legal words. "We hereby bequeath all of our assets, including our residential property at 1247 Maple Street, and all financial assets, currently valued at approximately $200,000, to our daughter Chelsea Marie Thompson." James leaned forward sharply in his chair, his gaze locked on the lawyer, as if he hoped that Mr. Collins would add something important to him. "That's it?" he exclaimed, not hiding his anger. "What about me?" Mr. Collins looked at him calmly. "The will clearly states that Miss Thompson is the sole heir." "This is nonsense." James turned to his lawyer. "They can't do this to me. I was their son." Mr. Patterson frowned, poring over the text of the will, and finally said, "The document seems to be drawn up properly. From a legal point of view, when you legally terminated your relationship with the Thompson family, returning to the custody of your biological parents, your right to inheritance disappeared." James's face turned purple with anger. In a fit of irritation, he gave out a stream of rude words to my parents, which made it unbearably painful for me. Even Mr. Patterson seemed uncomfortable, fidgeting in his chair and trying to avoid looking at his client. "Mr. Thompson," Mr. Collins said, interrupting James. "Your parents have one last request for Chelsea." He carefully removed an envelope from the folder, slightly yellowed at the edges. I immediately recognized Mom's and Dad's handwriting. The sight of him made my heart ache. I felt like I would break down if I opened it myself. "Could you read it for me?" I whispered, feeling my voice tremble. Mr. Collins nodded and carefully opened the envelope and began to read. "Dear Chelsea, if you are reading this, we are no longer around, and we are very sorry. We know you're strong, you've always been our rock, especially after James left, but you're also the kindest person we've ever known. Everything we have belongs to you now, the house where we created so many memories, the savings that we saved for your future, everything is in your hands. We fully trust your judgment. But we have one last hope. If James ever comes back, if he wants to say goodbye and show that somewhere in him the boy we loved so much still lives, Think about whether you can share this inheritance with him. It is only your choice. We will never dare to tell you what to do. You will find out in your heart if he deserves this chance. We love you, darling, and we love you both. It always has been and always will be. Mom and Dad. When Mr. Collins finished, I saw James's face change. His cold mask cracked, and something real, soft, almost pleading, flashed through its fragments. Chelsea. His voice became quiet, full of pleading, which I hadn't heard since childhood, when he was still my older brother. I didn't mean what I said before, James began, trying to sound sincere. Mom and Dad. I was just upset, you know. It's a shock to lose them. I looked at him, clearly seeing for the first time not the brother I once adored, but a stranger hidden behind a familiar face. He continued his speech, his voice filled with artificial emotions that did not convince me for a second. You're right, James paused, as if choosing his words. They raised me, took care of me. Maybe we could honor their memory by investing this money in my new business. They would like that. I interrupted him, surprisingly firmly for myself. Just stop it, James. He blinked, confused, but tried to regain the arrogance he was trying to shield himself with. I turned to Mr. Collins, who was watching us with the air of a man who has seen a lot, but still sympathetic. The letter says it's my choice, right? Yes, Miss Thompson, the decision is entirely yours, he confirmed, watching my words carefully. I straightened up, despite the internal storm raging from everything that had happened. Then the answer is no, James. You showed who you really are when you couldn't even put your phone down at their funeral. You called them worthless when their bodies were still warm, but they loved you until their last breath. My voice trembled slightly, but I continued without looking away. They were still hoping that you would find your way back to who they wanted you to be, but that person left. If he ever existed at all. With that, I went to the front door, opened it, and looked at James. Go away and don't come back. Don't try to contact me. James's face contorted with anger, his eyes narrowed. You, little one. Mr. Thompson, Mr. Patterson interrupted, grabbing James by the arm. I advise you to refrain from further comments. They can be regarded as harassment, with appropriate legal consequences. James pulled his hand away, but the threat of further trouble seemed to silence him anyway. He went to the exit, and for the last time the door slammed behind him so loudly that his mother's bells hanging over the threshold responded with a plaintive ringing, as if protesting against what once was and what is now irrevocably gone. That was 3 years ago. During this time, I graduated from college with honors, the way Mom and Dad always dreamed of. I kept their house, but it turned out to be too hard to live there because of the many memories, so I rented it out. I invested the money that I inherited the way my dad always advised, thoughtfully and with respect for their work in life. Sometimes people ask me if I regret my decision. I always answer, no, I don't regret it. Their last letter wasn't about money, but about choice, about how they chose to love James, even after he rejected them. They chose to hope, even when hope seemed futile, and, in the end, trusted me to make the right decision. I do not know what happened to James. I no longer check his social media pages, nor do I ask about him even the few mutual acquaintances I see. Sometimes I run into his biological parents at the grocery store and we exchange barely perceptible nods, but those doors are closed, and maybe they always will be. I keep Mom and Dad's letter in my desk. Not because I doubt my decision, but because it reminds me of the most important thing they taught me, that love is patient and love is kind. But also that true love requires the truth. And sometimes the most sincere form of love is knowing when to let go.